Hey, sorry about that. There was a slight delay because I didn't plug in my camera. I didn't even realize that I didn't do that. Let me fix the adjustment really quick. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Sorry about that little hiccup there. Welcome back. For those of you who might be joining for the first time, we've been covering basically the entire history of the African American historical timeline, basically giving you the origins of where everything in American society and culture kind of comes from, or it at least is in some way intimately connected to. And so, we've covered things from pre-colonial history of Africa to the history of the Americas, the indigenous tribes that inhabited these lands prior to colonization, the history around early colonization, the origins and early practices of chattel slavery, or how the colonial culture evolved to chattel slavery. If you're interested in all of that, you can find my YouTube channel. It's the link in my bio where you can basically follow along all the way up to where we are today. We're on the latter half of chapter two here, chapter 11 here, where essentially we're still covering the Civil War. We're in the middle of basically a deep dive into what the Civil War was actually like. Basically illuminating for you all of the ways in which perhaps early education has done a thing where they have whitewashed all of history, really, but specifically the Civil War. And so we're on the latter half of it. Here we are. If you want to jump into the lecture, if you want to see the lecture slides or anything like that, you're welcome to click the link in my bio. The very top link will take you over there. If you want to support me at all, if you like my lectures, if you like the work that I'm doing, you can join my Patreon. Give me $5, $3, $10, whatever you want to. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel, comment, like, do that whole thing. Um, and yeah, let's take off. So where we left off, the first part of what we were talking about around how we got to the Civil War was essentially Lincoln's role in it. We already established that several states have seceded because of 100 years long debate about slavery and whether it should expand or whether it should restrict. And essentially, some of those debates turning basically violent, right? And so, because Abraham Lincoln stepped into the presidency, lots of Southerners who had heavily invested in the institution of enslavement basically got paranoid that Lincoln would definitively move to end slavery, despite his assurances that he wouldn't. And so he gave them basically every opportunity to come back to the Union, giving them good grace and assuring them that slavery wouldn't end. And sure enough, by the time that they declared their own independence, there was no coming back from this, right? So here we are on the latter half of this, where we left off. The last slide we left off at was Lincoln finally, after being pushed time and time again, finally declaring the Emancipation Proclamation, right? That in all lands, in all territories, slavery would definitively end. And as soon as the nation could be reunified, slavery would formally end in the South as well. Okay. So at this point in time, now, by virtue of being free, Black people are technically allowed to enlist in the Union Army. And that is because, for the sake of declaring that the United States is officially ending slavery, essentially what you have here is there is some sort of political move to try to get Black people to be seen as like equal Americans, not necessarily equal in the sort of moral, emotional sense that you might be thinking of, like racial equality, they're just human beings kind of thing, but at least legislatively on paper, now that you have officially ended their second class citizenship status, it then means, or rather implies, that there is some form of equality there. And so at the very basic level, an abolishment of slavery would then at least symbolically entitle Black people to fight as Americans on behalf of the Union, if that makes sense, right? Um, so essentially, part of the Emancipation Proclamation did recognize that there is a strategic benefit in getting as many people as you can to engage in the war effort, even if they're Black, right? And so they recognize to some extent that given the heavy number of enslaved Black people in the South, there's basically no way that the Union is really going to stand a militaristic fight against the South, which they fully anticipate that these people are going to be compelling their slaves to fight for them, that they're going to win if they don't similarly leverage the power of Black people. So where have we seen this before? It's an arbitrary question, and we've talked about this several weeks prior, but I want to draw your attention to what's happening yet again. Is that where we have seen wartime efforts in the past, whether that was against the British, whether it was against the Spanish, whether it was against anyone else, it seems like Black people are like a strategic political tool, pawns on a chessboard, if you will, that both sides, whoever you consider to be the adversary in any naval or militaristic combat, everyone is trying to use Black people against the other side for their own purpose without necessarily trying to give the Black people involved equal status, equal citizenship, fair treatment, those kinds of things. So, yet again, I would like to point out that I guess I'm jumping a few slides ahead, but I would like to point out that the South will be using Black people and compelling them to fight on behalf of the Confederacy, while at the same time, simultaneously, the Union is now also leveraging the power of Black people for their own purpose. Now, we've already established all of the historical documents and evidence around the fact that the North was not necessarily morally superior to the South because they politically stood against the expansion of slavery. We've already gone into detail about that. If you want to see the lectures on that, please visit my YouTube channel. We cover that in extensive detail. Okay. So, would you even reasonably anticipate that just because Black people are now fighting for the Union, that they're going to be treated equally? Right? Feel free to type in the chat or unmute your mic and answer the question. Do you think Black people are just going to be treated equally now that they can fight on behalf of the Union? I want to see who's here. Would anyone like to chime in? It's fairly silent. Let me see the IG chat. No one on IG chat. Oh, yes, Glinda. Thank you. No, no, absolutely not. From what you know about the civil rights movement, Jim Crow, gentrification, right? Or yeah, gentrification. Um, any form of like anything relating to race, there is a default that Black people are inherently unequal. So, what makes you think that just because Lincoln can sign a piece of paper that declares that Black people now have some kind of status in American society, that now suddenly everybody's just going to be falling in line and giving it to them, right? So, no, okay, Black soldiers, even though they would enlist in the Union Army, they would fight for the Union Army. Yes, guns and muskets, rifles would be put in their hands, uniforms put in their hands. That does not necessarily mean that they're now just going to be glorified and honored in the eyes of American history. Now, having said that, when you enlist, there is a process, right? There's an enlistment process. You get paid, your name gets recorded down, they know where your assignments are. You take a picture, right? That becomes a thing. So the pictures that you're seeing here of Black Union soldiers, these are real pictures. Okay. Okay. The one on the left is not actually from the Civil War. That's actually from another Cuban war. However, it's from the same era, right? The era of post emancipation, technically right? We've already established that the Emancipation Proclamation was more like symbolic because it doesn't really mean anything if they don't necessarily win the war. So the only way that this Emancipation Proclamation is going to carry any weight is if they actually win the militaristic combat, right? So you can imagine then that the first black soldier, the first 100, the first 1,000, everybody basically is facing these unending bouts of discrimination from white Northern troops. Yes, the name calling. Yes, the violent, vitriolic attacks. Yes, perhaps discrimination in resource sharing, food sharing, perhaps undermining these people's ability to aid in the effort simply because they're black. Those kinds of things, right? So you had some white people. Obviously, we've already established in American history that there were white people in the North and even in the South, but mainly in the North, who were always tolerant of black people, some people who were explicit abolitionists, right? And you have this gray area. It's a spectrum. You have people who are extreme practical abolitionists, and then you have people who are like political abolitionists but don't believe in racial equality whatsoever. So in that gray area then, and in the context of the Union Army, you have white people that are then able to tolerate black soldiers, but only because they prefer for these black soldiers to die before they do. Okay. So some white soldiers are thinking to themselves, yeah, well, great. We have black soldiers and that's awesome, but maybe you could put them in the front lines. Maybe they can take the brunt of all of the heavy hits. If there's going to be cannonballs launched at people's faces, guns shot in the air or whatever, the first wave of people on the front lines are expected to absolutely die, then maybe you just front the line with niggers. Okay. And that's the sentiment that is always going to be the sentiment, right? And so that's even going to trickle down into, or like these sentiments, I mean, is going to trickle down into even something as mundane, retrospectively speaking, as the pay process, right? That by virtue of enlisting and fighting on behalf of the Union Army, you will officially be paid a wage, but because you're black, you cannot necessarily be paid equally to white soldiers. You're not going to because symbolically on paper, yes, you are technically equal, you are technically free, but you're still black. You're still niggers. You're still inherently inferior. You still represent desecration of the land. You still pose a threat biologically and genetically to the superiority of whiteness. We need to maintain that racial distinction. So, where Union soldiers, white Union soldiers, were being paid $13 a month, could somebody do me a favor? Open up a tab in Google and do the conversion on the currency there. What is in 1863 $13 a month in 2026 US dollars. And then once you figure out that number, give me the number for $10 a month, which is what black people were being paid. I'm absolutely curious here, but I don't want to open a tab because I don't want to fudge up any of my streaming gear going on here. If you want to type that into the chat, or you're welcome to unmute your mic for a hot second and just kind of shout out the number. I'd love to hear your input on this. $13 a month in 1863 converted, adjusting for inflation to 2026. And then $10 a month, adjusting for inflation, same year to 2026. What number do you get? Unmute mic on what? What? Unmute mic. I don't know what that means. Superdank 4Z. Unmute mic on what? I'm not sure. Okay, so the 300, somebody chimed in the IG chat. They said $340. Thank you, Hideout 3K. $340 today. Is that the $13 a month or is that the $10 a month? Which one are we talking? Okay. You also have to remember housing is a lot cheaper. Food is a lot cheaper. Please stream to YouTube, King. I will. I upload all of these recordings to to YouTube. I pre-record them and then I record that way. Sorry, I was asking what else are y'all watching on? Go to the link in my bio. Click the top link if you want to jump in on the Zoom session live. Okay. Thank you for the $13 a month. So whatever the $10 a month adjusting for inflation is, we're talking about roughly $340 a month today. Okay. And so then the $10 a month will be a significant difference. Okay. Now, having said that, you still have black soldiers that are fighting. They're fighting in conflicts. They're fighting on the front lines. They're fighting in strategic positions. They're also lending their intellectual prowess, right? Okay. So you have lots of black soldiers, even white soldiers and leaders too, sergeants even, that are like confronting the discrimination. They're addressing the fact that like racial discrimination in the Union Army is actually like stepping on our toes. It's not useful. Not only is it not useful, but it seems to be counterintuitive to the whole purpose of even engaging in militaristic combat with the other side in the first place, is we're kind of just like preventing ourselves from winning. One of the first regiments to challenge the inherent racial discrimination in the Union Army was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Okay. And this was a regiment that was led by Sergeant William Walker, a white sergeant, a white military leader. Okay. And in leading this regiment, he swore and made everybody commit to refusing to accept their pay from the Union Army until they ensured that black soldiers would be paid equally. Okay. Somebody chimed in. They said, I don't know how to say your name, Florida Pierre. You'll have to forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. $13 in 1861 is the equivalent of purchasing power of approximately $487 today. $10 in 1861, due to inflation, would have the purchasing power of roughly $370 today. So there you go. Thank you so much, Florida Pierre. Um, Now, having said that, getting back to my point, right? Here's a white soldier, a white sergeant who is leading the initiative in not just fighting against the Confederacy, but also ensuring that the Union Army is not going to be fighting on unequal footing that is almost entirely unnecessary, right? So he ordered white soldiers and black soldiers alike not to take pay until that pay was equal. And he was subsequently charged with mutiny. He was convicted and found guilty and then shot, executed, if you will. Okay. So let this be clear here. Let's be clear. None of this should be surprising. Okay. Um, that to some extent, where you've always had white people that were committed to racial equality, and even on the front lines of like, let's pretend and say the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law last month, right? You have white people who are a part of the military that want equality there too, because again, whiteness is not monolithic here. Okay. So he wants equality. And I would go so far as to say, even though my talking points, and I know to some extent the book, the chapter that I uploaded to the Patreon, even though it talks about this issue in a limited way, you can also use a lot of the information that we've covered throughout this class so far to kind of deduce where that's coming from. Right? Here is a white person who probably represents political abolitionism to some extent, and perhaps if he's willing to go on record and like putting his career at risk in ensuring that black people are paid equally to white, then to some extent, I'm not saying he's like William Lloyd Garrison, but he's probably on that political spectrum that is similar in, for lack of a better term, a radical political nature akin to a William Lloyd Garrison. Okay. And so, on that basis, because you have a white man who's so unabashed in his fight for equality, he's probably facing casual criticism from his commanding officers, perhaps from some of his colleagues, that he's a nigger lover. and that a nigger lover, it's already sacrilege that we have to fight in the same army with other niggers, but now we also have white men in positions of power and leadership that are trying to compel the United States to give them equal treatment, and we need you to turn your attention to the Confederacy, right? So subsequently, then he's charged with mutiny, convicted, and shot. Okay. Um, right? So that doesn't end there, right? That's just one instance, okay? In other instances, you have like pay discrepancies in which Black people are also calling out the inequality here, okay? They don't necessarily want to be treated equally. The entire time, you have to remember, it's not like suddenly overnight because Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law that now suddenly Black people have a chip on their shoulder and are demanding equality. They've been demanding equality since they were on the plantation fields. They wanted freedom since they were picking cotton and harvesting watermelon and peaches, right? So none of this should be new. But now that Black people have technically a different political footing by virtue of the Emancipation Proclamation, that is a call to equality too. And part of it is inspired, I don't want to say specifically by the sergeant who was charged with mutiny and then killed, right? But rather you do have a kind of infighting within the Union that is motivating Black people to speak up for themselves, right? Even if colloquially white people in the North still don't see them as equals. So in Texas, for example, and this is in Texas, but among a Union army. Okay. This was a Black artillery unit from Rhode Island. And basically, there was a pay dispute in which a white officer had given this Black man what he was entitled to on differential, racially unequal pay. And then that white officer took a verbal lashing from this Black man. And I'm not trying to make light of this situation, but if you want to conjure up the imagery in your mind, I would liken it to that scene from Indiana Jones, in which Indiana Jones is standing there and there's a guy and he's swinging his sword and he's doing all kinds of tricks and flips and whatever. And then Indiana Jones pulls out a gun and shoots him, right? If you want to liken it to Han shot first as he's sitting down talking to the alien in the cantina bar, and then he just shoots him at the table. It's that kind of environment here. Okay, where now this officer, a white officer, shot and killed a Black man who was on his side, who was just arguing over a pay dispute, but the region's commander isn't going to charge the officer with like murder, right? With treason, anything like that. Well, why? Because he's Black. Because he's Black. So keep in mind, right, at all times and in all ways, the North is not morally superior. They don't have this inherent belief that Black people deserve to be free and all the niggers deserve to have the right to vote and are they're American too and blah, blah, blah. That's not happening. Okay. So it's still a dog eat dog world for Black people, even if slavery is formally ended officially in the North and symbolically in the South. Okay. So now the Black men who are taking unequal pay and are put in a uniform, are given a gun or a musket, okay, they're put in every battle, right? Because there's no strategic advantage without these Black people here, but they are strategically being placed in compromising positions. They are being sacrificed on the front lines. They are being put in positions where you know you might lose your footing against the Confederacy here or there, but if you can help it, put a team of niggers over there and see what they can do. Okay. So, Black units, the Union Army is fighting in a racially segregated circumstance most of the time. Okay. Elena says, but I thought we established in the lecture last week that if not for Confederates, there would be equality in treatment. I'm not sure what you mean. Would you like to unmute your mic and expand your question?
Yeah, hi. Yeah,
Yeah.
what I'm
Hi.
This is, I thought that if not for Confederates, then Black people would have been treated equally by everybody else, that the only sort of racists, in a way,
Hmm.
were, I thought we established this new kind of idea that these were the people that weren't punished, and therefore um, the racism continued, and it's,
Yeah,
mm,
I would say everybody's racist. The Confederates are just a little more extreme and methodical. They want slavery. The racists in the North don't necessarily want slavery, but it doesn't mean they want racial equality, right? Um, I'm
mm-hmm,
sorry for the confusion, but if you were to go back over not just the course of last week, but over the course of several lectures in the weeks prior, I had been establishing for quite a while that the soldiers in the North were also anti-black, or not just the soldiers in the North, but white people in the North, which
mm-hmm.
again, I'm talking about it in this specific context while also trying to maintain the distinction that whiteness is not monolithic, but there are white
Right.
people who are anti slavery, but not necessarily racial equality or like pro equality. Yeah.
But when you say racism, you don't mean like everyone's racist just because you mean like actually like negatively racist.
Yeah. In
People
this
who are
kind, well,
negative.
yeah, I suppose whenever I use the word racism, I'm always talking about racism in some form, but here I am talking about the negative, bigoted, overt discrimination form. Yes.
So we wouldn't be there as we, okay, sorry that I can't let it go, but like
Okay.
we wouldn't have been there at the place where we would have equality earlier then, because people in the North were still kind of, as you're saying,
Oh,
negatively
I
racist.
see what you're asking. Okay.
Yeah.
So allow me to clarify. Last week we were talking around the idea that if the Confederates were properly punished, that the timeline
Mhm.
of American history would be distinct and different, and that we would have probably established racial equality much earlier. Now, the point I
Mhm.
was making there was not necessarily that the North wasn't racist and bigoted, but rather that if there weren't through the timeline of US history, the sequence of blockades, impediments, forms of legislative discrimination that, yes, technically, over the grand scheme of time, you might have established racial equality much earlier than we did in reality, but that didn't
Mhm.
happen. So over time, I'm not necessarily saying that like, oh, the moment Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation into law, suddenly white people are now motivated by racial equality, but rather that the subsequent impediments, if those did not happen the way that they did, then the total amount of time, like the fact that it took nearly 100 years after this point in time to get to the civil rights movement, that is a
Mhm.
long period of time. It probably would have happened much sooner.
Mhm.
And by the next chapter, you'll start to see what I mean. It was already headed in that direction. But we're
Thank
just
you.
not there yet.
Mhm. Got it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yeah. All right. So, back to my point here is black people were being disproportionately positioned in compromising positions in order to sacrifice to save the lives of white soldiers. Okay, so black people are being sacrificed. That's what I meant when I used that word. Okay, um, and so that's happening. But this is the default. Everyone is expecting that like if there is a circumstance in which you could potentially save white people from being gunned down, blasted out, killed and marauded or whatever, that you just put black people in that position instead. It means then that you can dedicate all of the manpower to the soldiers who you genuinely care about to some other position that you believe might be more advantageous in your position. So the Union is fighting against their own racism while also fighting against the Confederates. Okay. Um, all right. So, okay. Um, part of this is now the Confederates are insulted by the fact that they have to fight against niggers. How dare the Union force them to engage in militaristic combat between two allegedly sovereign nations, and one side has to fight against niggers, as if the Confederates weren't already employing their slaves. But they're still leveraging this criticism that, like, why is it that, like, all we're seeing on the front lines here is just black people? Why are we fighting against black people like white people? What's going on here? Because remember what we had described in the events that led up to this moment, right? Is even Lincoln, from Lincoln all the way down on the Union side, no one really wanted to fight against the Confederates, in part because they're white. Why do white people want to go to war against other white people fighting on behalf of the same country, right? When we could just rejoin, you guys can keep your slaves, and then Lincoln will be president. He'll do what he can, and yada yada, right? So now the Confederates are insulted. They're attacking Union garrisons. They're trying to get into positions where they can take a fort or to take some land to claim for themselves from the Union, expand the territory that they're saying belong to the Confederate States of America. But pretty much everywhere that they are militaristically moving, uh, they are facing these black people who are armed with like outdated muskets because black people aren't being given the most up-to-date technology here. They're being given the shitty leftovers and hand-me-downs. Okay. Um, and so in some cases, these black people are actually winning. Now, I know that I'm saying black people are being sacrificed, they're being disproportionately killed, but take the trades where you can. It's not, this isn't a monolithic event. You do have black people who are armed with outdated weaponry that are, in some cases, winning against militaristic combat against the Confederates. Those things are happening too. So hats off to them. Usario says, you're saying that black people were used as some kind of human shield. Yes, they were being strategically used as like meat shields to save white people. Okay. So like I said, the Southerners who are just pro-slavery here are still, I guess, uh, to me, I don't know. I'm a little bit confused by this because in one sense, if you're willing to like leverage your own slaves to aid in the war against the Union, then how can you simultaneously be insulted that you have to fight black people against the Union side? But nonetheless, they're like insulted. And where they can, they're like capturing these black people. In some cases, they are executing them. Black people are being executed, either hung by their necks or just killed on sight, like point blank range execution. In some other cases where they could, many of these black people were just taken as prisoners of war and then sold into slavery on the Confederate side. So the Confederacy is doing a thing where they can, yes, they're trying to destabilize and win militaristic combats, and then do what they can to teach these black people and the Union a lesson about fighting against the Confederacy on behalf of the matter of slavery. But that also, this is like free picking for just taking more black people and then going to put them to work on the slave plantation in the South somewhere. Okay, so that's happening too. Now, at the same time, okay, um, you have the Confederates that are unwilling to recognize these black men as legitimate soldiers, as people worthy of honor, as people who are deserving of the consideration of being humanized to some extent on the battlefield, right? That even though you recognize these people as your enemy, and yeah, you might have to kill them on the battlefield, there's a level of dehumanization that comes with having to kill these black people. Again, feel free to replace black people with the word nigger here because that is the emotional sentiment around this regard. Why do we have to why are we fighting niggers? You can't come and fight us yourself, right? Okay. one Confederate leader. I don't know who, but your book is specific about this. I didn't include the name in the slide. You'll have to forgive me because I'm human. But he said here, we ought to never be inconvenienced with such prisoners, because the idea is if you are taking niggers as prisoners of war, you're going to be responsible for trying to like use their lives to like negotiate strategic plays against the Union. And so now you're forced into a position where you have niggers as your prisoners that you're then going, "Hey, Union Army, we have your niggers and we're going to kill them if you don't give us the money, right? Give us what we want or do whatever we want to by 5 p.m. tomorrow." I'm completely making it up, but you can see that when you center white supremacy as the operative norm, it does to some extent appear a little bit silly and outlandish that now suddenly you have Confederates that are trying to like negotiate using niggers. So they're insulted, and they're insulted by the fact that like it just feels weird. It feels taboo. It feels like it's like a Saturday Night Live skit, to put it in some form of modern day terms. It's like satire. It's almost like a joke, right? So, in essence, then the best practical approach that they can really take is to treat these black soldiers as if they are rebellious slaves, and to take that approach conceptually, strategically, culturally is just you're basically these black men that you're taking as prisoners of war are just rebellious black men that are trying to incite a slave rebellion of some kind. And you can beat them, you can break the horse, you can beat them and whip them into shape and get them into a position where they're not willing to go and incite a rebellion, or they'll have their tongue cut out, or they'll get their foot cut off, or something like that. But in general, um, they are thinking that it's better to take that approach. Usario says, "Sorry, I'm learning a lot about racism in the US from your lecture, because in Brazil, this pattern repeated in other contexts. What black people gained joining in order to fight against certain rights? Um, or were they forced to fight along the white people?" Could you unmute your mic and clarify your question for me? If you have a mic, I'm sorry. I don't know if you do. I would love it if you could clarify your question, Usario. Maybe he's
Hi,
typing. Oh, yeah, here you go.
hi
Okay.
guys.
Hey.
Well, my question is, in this war,
Mhm.
black people joined because they were forced to, or they would gain some certain rights after war, after
Mm, mm.
winning the war. That's
Oh,
that's
that's
my
the question.
question.
Yeah. So black people in this context are fighting because they want to join the effort to kill enslavers. So they're not being forced. They're not being promised with some incentive. Abraham Lincoln had already guaranteed the end of slavery. So the black people who are fighting in the North, they just want to kill enslavers. They want to kill the Confederates. They want to kill these white people who have been enslaving their ancestors. And that's why they're fighting. Does that answer your question? Okay, hopefully it does. I'm not sure.
Oh
All right.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you
Yep.
so much.
There we go. Okay. So, okay, that's going back to the point anyway around the Confederates being insulted that they have to deal with taking black people as prisoners of war, treating them to some extent as if they're somehow equal, when even the Union knows they're not equal. But now this is like militaristic combat that they now have to navigate in this new terrain where black people are now suddenly fighting on behalf of the Union. Okay. So there are lots of circumstances in which the Confederates are going and like sneaking on to specific forts at nighttime, and slaughtering people, catching them off guard, and just killing them in their sleep. At no point should you think about any militaristic combat here as somehow being like honor centered or like honor driven. Okay. Here, specifically in the event of the Fort Pillow massacre, Fort Pillow had roughly like 300 black troops or so that were led by a white commander, William Bradford. Okay. And what happened was they were caught off guard in the middle of the night where Confederate soldiers had snuck onto the fort and essentially just started mercilessly killing these people, stabbing them in the neck, shooting them in the face. You can use your imagination in this regard, right? A few of these black people had surrendered. They weren't prepared for combat. And so at what point, if you can spare your life, then maybe you just kind of put up your hands, wave a white flag or something, and hope they don't shoot you in the face, right? Um, but essentially, that didn't happen. Okay. Some black people surrendered and then were taken as slaves or newly acquired slaves to be broken in, but most of them were essentially just massacred. Like teaching the black people who they're going to take as slaves a lesson by essentially randomly shooting people. It becomes like a massacre. Okay. Um, so they essentially murdered everybody there. And the North never like militaristically retaliated. They never officially responded or gave an official response to what happened on Fort Massacre. There were no statements, there was nothing. They just pretended as if nothing really happened. Okay. Um, so essentially, you can see how the North, feel free to Google Fort Pillow Massacre. You'll see all of the documentation around this. Um, you can see where the North's priorities are, right? Is even as you have resources being spent for Black people to go and fight on behalf of the Union really doesn't care that much. Okay. So even though the North never officially retaliated, you had black troops that were all aware of what happened at Fort Pillow and tried to engage in their own form of let's say guerrilla retaliation, right? And that retaliation there is when they can, they will go to wherever Confederate prisoners are held and they're shouting, "Remember Fort Pillow." And remember Fort Pillow as they're killing these people, killing them in their jail cells, killing them in their shackles, doing what they can to retaliate. And it's not like an overnight retaliation. It's like, several weeks, some time goes by. You have Confederates that know what happened at Fort Pillow. You have the Union that knows what happened at Fort Pillow. Everyone knows what happened. So it's not like suddenly a person is just like the next night sitting in a cell, and then suddenly you have a bunch of angry black people coming to kill this guy shouting, "Remember Fort Pillow." There's some context behind that. They know what's going on here. Okay. So I'm talking about it as if it happened overnight, but keep in mind the realistic nature under which these things are happening. Okay. Now, on the northern side, right, there's still this sentiment of we still don't like you. We don't want niggers on our forts. We don't want you in our camps. We don't want you sharing food around a campfire. It's indecent for you to be here. Okay. So even in circumstances where these black garrisons, these black troops are really demonstrating intellect, power, efficiency, fitness, what have you, uh, they're still not being respected. You have lots of white Northerners that are absolutely bitter, sometimes even violently hostile to the black people that they have to share space with, um, because that's the norm. That's the culture norm here. Okay, is you shouldn't make peace with these people. They belong under your control. They belong beneath your boot. They belong under your foot. And so Northerners are also getting a little bit irritated at the fact that Lincoln even really made them do this in the first place. Okay. So where you have, like I said, you can almost use the Indiana Jones or like the Star Wars analogy to kind of fill in the your imagination with what's actually going on here. These people are regularly like using intimidation, threats, terror. In some cases, they are attacking and maiming these black people. In some cases, killing them. So it's like they're like soldiers that are killing the soldiers on their own side. Okay. And what I want you to recognize here, even though we haven't necessarily gotten to the major retrospective angle just yet, I need you to see from the place of 2026, what benefit does this give the union? Right? Being racially discriminatory in this way, fundamentally like bigoted, oppressive, basically friendly fire, engaging in friendly fire. What is that actually doing to help the union? It isn't. So I want to highlight this very real and persistent problem that really hasn't gone away in American society, even though I'm talking about it in the Civil War era. And that is that you have a conflict between strategic efficiency, and I want to say, let's say, operational efficiency and culture norms, where racism, and yes, I mean that word in its bigoted form as well as the non-bigoted form. Racism is a culture norm. And when you hire other human beings that, let's say monolithically belong to American culture, where American culture can only really be distinguished as consumerism and racism or racial superiority, you now have people that are fundamentally compromised even where you need to rely on them in critical moments and in critical times. That now, when the US is put in a compromising position that needs all hands on deck, you need the best minds, the best people to contribute, the most qualified people to work together in a collaborative fashion to make sure that the mission gets complete. You now have people that are fundamentally eroding the ability to do so because they are compromised by their racial sentiments, their sense of racial superiority, their white supremacy, and their entitlement. And what I'm describing here, I just said to you, is something that it transcends the timeline of American history. And it's a problem that hasn't yet gone away because now that we're looking at the commander in chief, the president of the United States, who's not only actively putting the United States in compromising positions on the global front, but what is fundamentally responsible for him even doing so? A sense of entitlement, the operating around these ridiculous culture norms, a sense of racial superiority, turning inward and attacking people who are like fundamentally on your side or have the ability to aid in your ability to like operate more efficiently outside of the US, right? That's what's happening here. So recognize that like there are connections to the ways that like the craziness we're seeing of like a Donald Trump or a Pete Hegseth or like a to some extent an Elon Musk, although I don't necessarily consider him American like I would the former two, right? These people who are fundamentally unqualified, but because they're American, are put to task and then cannot efficiently complete the goals or objectives of the operation because they're compromised by themselves. Okay. That doesn't come from nowhere. Okay. And until the United States of America is really genuinely willing to reckon with the reality of what racial supremacy, the culture norms of racial supremacy, and I'm specifically talking about white supremacy, is actually doing to jeopardize the sovereignty of the country, yeah, we're on a downward spiral, and that shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Much in the same way that the Union was on a downward spiral, despite the fact that in the end, they win. Okay. So building on those connections there, where you can now see that there is a culture norm of racial entitlement, supremacy, discrimination, infighting, murder, friendly fire, whatever you have here, right? Back in New York, well into the north, this is not a battle zone here. Okay. For all intents and purposes, New York City should be relatively peaceful, all things considered. Okay. You have military that is trying to actively draft more people to the war effort. Okay. You have it doesn't matter. They're not necessarily engaging in a form of racial selection on who they're trying to enlist. They're trying to get as many people as they can to help aid against the fight against the Confederates. Okay. So here in New York, you have the Democrat Party. Okay. The Democrat Party, who in this time period are the white supremacists. Okay. They were always the white supremacists. They are the grandfathers of modern contemporary conservatism today, not the same party. Democrats are trying to take what Lincoln is doing here to essentially politically assassinate his administration and his platform. I said politically assassinate. They're not trying to like literally kill the man right now, but they are trying to take this opportune moment to go, see, look at what Lincoln is doing. Lincoln's actually just helping black people. All he's doing here is fighting on behalf of black people. Look at where your taxpayer dollars are going. Look at where your votes are going. Lincoln isn't doing anything on behalf of the white man like he said he would do on the campaign trail, right? And so they're just trying to politically position so that by the time the either the midterms or the next presidential cycle comes around, people are so angry and upset that they're willing now to vote against Lincoln. Okay, so the white supremacists here, as represented by the party we call Democrats, are just trying to find politically opportune moments to position themselves. Something we already see, not just in American political discourse, but elsewhere in the world too. So you have like these Irish workers, people who either migrated from Ireland or are the generation of people who migrated from Ireland, born on American soil but raised by Irish parents. They don't like the idea that like black people are anticipating and clearly getting what appears to be progressive equal benefits in society, because that then means that black people are now competitors on the job market for opportunities, for money acquisition or wage acquisition. Black people represent a threat to like Irish working class people. So you have angry Irishmen that are in New York City that are now showing up at these military draft events and are like sabotaging it. They're attacking the venue. They're attacking the black people that are trying to show up and enlist. They're attacking even some of the white people that are there defending them too. And it turns into an all out riot, a riot that lasts for 4 days. And during this 4 day riot, the police were not able to effectively stop it. It kind of had to just like fizzle out on its own when people were tired. Imagine fighting for 4 days, right? Just constant chaos. You're lighting buildings on fire, destroying communities, sabotaging what you can. That now you have the American people on the Union side, because everybody is technically American here, but you have citizens, not military operatives, but citizens that are now undermining the military effort of the Union too. So it's not, even though I'm talking about this as if the Union soldiers are also like somehow intellectually, culturally, racially compromised, it seems to be prevalent among the populace that what we're characterizing here is a kind of cultural phenomenon in which the social psyche is now undermining its own foundation. Okay. So connect that to the present era. I'm going to be doing this a lot from here on out, and it's gonna become a repeated theme that I want you to be able to connect. That like where do we see this in the modern era? Where like you have people on social media, for example, your Brandon Tatums, what were once your Charlie Kirks, your Tucker Carlsons, who are just espousing political opinions by virtue of the First Amendment. And I'm not necessarily criticizing the First Amendment, more than I'm saying, look at how they are using these politically opportune moments to undermine the foundation of the so-called homeland, right? That now it becomes a thing where you have people who are willing to engage in a form of infighting where they're like eroding the stability of their own homes, their own society, because they're driven by like a vitriolic form of racial animosity. Some of them are joining ICE, some of them are killing American citizens. it's kind of like inching in that direction. And to no extent am I saying that the ICE crisis, I would call that a crisis. The ICE crisis is somehow akin to a 4-day riot of violence and people dying. I'm not necessarily drawing equivalence there, but I want you to see the elements, make the connection that, like, not only is it where it matters most that our efforts to complete objectives, to win goals, to accomplish a mission is being eroded and undermined, but in the minds of the average American psyche are people who are firmly committed to eroding our ability to win too. And they don't even really think about it that way, right? They don't necessarily think, oh, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to attack so and so because I don't want my own country to win the war. They're just completely tunnel visioned on their own racial animosity. The idea that they could get their own, and that if they don't get their own, then we're going to blame the niggers for it, and the niggers are the problem, and we need to make sure that these niggers are not jeopardizing our entitlement to our jobs, to our work, that they're not coming here, they're stealing our jobs, it's illegal, and blah, blah, blah. You can start to see how the connections are made. Elena says, so then what are people, white people, protesting then and now the most? Inclusivity, equality? Yes. Yes. And they don't have the language of DEI, right? No one is saying, oh, look at the military draft. It's engaging in DEI and this is a threat to American stability and blah, blah, blah. But that is fundamentally what's happening. They are fundamentally against the idea that Black people can be included. And with Black people being included and functionally equal, that now somehow means that they're going to lose out on the jobs they're entitled to. They're going to lose out on the opportunities they feel like deserve to go to them. Sound familiar? Right? So here in this era, it's just a little more vitriolic. It's a little more like I would say it's a little bit more like now you have the military, the Union military, that not only now has to fight Confederates, but somehow now has to fight the American people too. You see how that works? So are we aiding the US in succeeding in reunifying the nation? Well, no, because everybody is racially compromised. And that racial compromise is eroding national security, if you will. Sound familiar? Okay. So now on the Confederate side, okay, here's what's happening on the Confederate side. I'm so sorry if people in the IG Live have been asking questions. I'm scrolling up a little bit. Okay, no one's really been asking questions. Great, because I'm so focused on this PowerPoint right now that I can't see your questions unless I intentionally go after them. If you're listening on IG Live and you want to be able to jump into the Zoom session, click the link in my bio or just sit tight and wait for Q&A where I will be able to see your chat feed. Okay. So now on the Confederate side, okay, these are real pictures of Confederate soldiers. The picture on the right that you see here, those are Black Confederate soldiers. They did not voluntarily fight for the Confederacy. Okay. Many of them were enslaved. Okay. Some of them were freed in the South, and as I will soon explain to you, free Black people were compelled by the Confederacy to fight under the threat that they would be enslaved or imprisoned or something to that effect. Okay. And then the image above me here, these are two Confederate generals. I do not know their names, but if you want to reverse image search, you're welcome to go to Google and look them up. And that is their slave. That is their house nigger. Okay? The house nigger, the Black person who is dutiful and loyal to the slave master and helps them to do whatever it is that they need to do and is willfully subservient. Okay? So that's a thing too. Okay. So essentially, of course, as the war is going on, you're losing lives, you're losing your numbers are dwindling. There's always going to be a demand for more troops. Okay. And so you need troops, you need laborers, both on the Union side and on the Confederate side. But now we're talking about the Confederacy. Okay. So you have slave owners both the slave owners and their slaves were compelled to contribute to the war effort against the Union. And if they didn't, slave owners could lose possession of their slaves. The enslaved, the only threat you can really give them is just death at that point. You can't say, right? But they're not necessarily incentivizing this with like, well, we'll give you your freedom, right? Because the whole purpose of them even seceding was because they wanted to keep their slaves. Okay. So the the Congress, the Confederate Congress here. Okay, yes, the Confederate States of America had their own congressional body, and their own congressional body, then engaging in their own democratic process, is requiring that free Black people enroll in military effort, either as a laborer or as a soldier. Um, okay, so here you have the Confederate Congress that is doing a really interesting thing that I want you to connect to the modern era here. And that is that the Confederate Congress is exempting men who owned 20 slaves or more from military service. So, in a class specific way, they're essentially exempting the economic elite from having to go onto a battlefield and risk their lives. We could say then in the Confederate context, we're talking about the people who represent the economic elite or the ultra wealthy. Okay. And so the Confederacy, there are lots of historical images here. This is not a fake photo. This is very much a real photo here of a Confederate soldier and his nigger slave. His nigger slave was a young boy. We might guess reasonably he's probably between the age of 15 to 12 or something like that. Glinda says, I have bone spurs. Yeah, that's not going to count here. Right. Um, but the only way that you could be exempted from fighting on behalf of the Confederacy is if you represented the interests of the economic elite. Usually the economic elite were people who owned 20 slaves or more. But there were some people who only owned one slave, which is why you see them taking pictures with them, right? Okay. There is one Confederate soldier that's documented in history. He originally was fighting on behalf of the Mississippi Confederacy, but he deserted them. And he deserted them on the basis that he says, I did not propose to fight for the rich men while they were at home having a good time. What does that sound like? Does that sound familiar? Right? Here's Glinda saying, I have bone spurs, right? And she's saying bone spurs for a specific reason because the president of the United States, a draft dodger, dodged the draft on the basis that he had bone spurs, but was able to get away with it because he's economically elite. Sound familiar? Right? Okay. So make the connections. Just because we're talking about this, it happened 150 years ago, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a completely different book. It's still the same book, just a different chapter. Okay. I also want to I want to pivot for just a second. We're almost done here, by the way. I'm going a little over 5 o'clock. We have about 5 more slides, but I want to point something out here that the pictures that you're seeing of these Confederate soldiers with their niggers, and I'm using that term because that's the term that they would use. The pictures that you're seeing with their niggers, you notice that the ones who only have one slave in their possession are young boys. Very rarely did these men take young girls. Part of the reason for that is logistical. The other part is sexual. Okay. So, where we talk about in history, this idea of like, Black women were raped, impregnated by white men on the plantation, and that happened. I am not trying to belittle that. I'm not trying to like somehow minimize the sexual atrocity there, we often talk about these issues in a heteronormative sense, as if somehow like homosexuality is this new age phenomenon that just came out of nowhere, and none of these men were sexually assaulting or raping any of these other boys, right? We often default to this heteronormative narrative of like the damsel in distress. And again, I say that for the normative rhetorical connection, not necessarily because I'm minimizing the atrocity. Okay. Now, having said that, very rarely do we talk about the rampant, sexually violent, deviant, and homonormative practices of many of these Confederate people. You could go to many of these. I've seen some influencers on Instagram show up and they're like, why is it that the conservative right is so fixated on transsexuals? And then pull up some data about how whenever there's a Republican convention, Grindr has like all of these numbers of people, gay men that are congregating in these areas, and they're like meeting and hooking up, and it's all these white conservative men and blah, 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 right? I need you to understand that back in this era, those things are going on too. And in the context of enslavement, that often meant that not only is slavery like a power play, some of the Epstein files describe the sexual deviance of many of these economically elite people who are sexually motivated by power, right? And the abuse of power and the abuse of power on these other innocent, vulnerable bodies. Well, then why are these white men in possession of young black boys, right? They get them at extremely young ages, specifically because then you can raise them under the norm of being regularly sexually violated by these people. And then when they grow older, they are then used to, conditioned to being used in this way. Okay. Jen says, who would believe them? Well, yeah, but it's not like any of these boys have the ability to speak out, to say, oh, so and so is violating me and I need help. And who cares? Who cares what this nigger thinks? No one gives a fuck about the nigger's life. Okay, so now the nigger's getting anally violated. Well, yeah, why are you? You're gay and a blah blah blah. Well, mind your business. That's his slave. Who cares? So in this era, then it becomes a thing where I want you to then make the connection to the Epstein phenomenon that's going on, the underground human trafficking, the of mainly girls, but also boys included in this phenomenon, regularly violating people, silencing them in extremely perverse ways, right? I need you to understand that if you can admit to some extent that there are still Americans that wear, or excuse me, wave Confederate flags, they're obsessed with the Confederacy. There's footage of a guy who can't even say whether he's against slavery or not. That if these people and the cultural and historical inertia survives into the present era, the cultural and historical inertia of the slave master and slave master like behavior has also survived in the modern era too. And I would go so far as to say, yes, I have the audacity to say it, the economic elite are essentially analogous to the Civil War era's slave masters. These are the things that they're doing. And we're uncovering it by virtue of the Epstein files. But these things have been going on. They've developed a norm around just being able to do these things and get away with it because it's always been that way for them. Do you understand? Right? So again, even though we're talking about African American history here and we're talking about Black history and certain parts of American history you've never really been exposed to, look at all of the ways you did not anticipate that this could potentially shed light on everything you're looking at on CNN, on the news, on MSNBC, on Reddit, on wherever, where like now they're trying to bury all of this shit under the surface and they're doing their best to do so. It's a really shitty job. But people are acting shocked as if like, oh, they just started discovering this and doing this like in the 80s and it was only a recent thing. No, this has been going on for hundreds of years. And prior to the Civil War, hundreds of years before that. Okay. Elena says, I have a reverse question. If this is the norm, why are they like that just now? It feels like too many people are racist. Could you expand? I need you to unmute and expand here because I don't really know what you're asking.
Can you hear me? I'm
Yes.
just wearing a headphone.
Yes.
All right, so wait a second. I'll just gather my thoughts for this one because this question is pretty horrible.
Okay. Okay. Ask it.
So if people are so racist and like these people that you just mentioned are essentially sort of like slave masters, then it's their norm, right? It's the norm that wasn't defeated, right? So this is
Correct.
the premise here. So if this is the norm, and we're kind of now seeing by, as you said, by virtue of being able to take a look at the Epstein files, that this is normal for them, what was happening. And if we are discovering that this is the norm and a lot of people are coming out and actually are not scared to say or act on their beliefs or being like, I don't know, weird around other, well, just essentially being racist, and people see that there are a lot of racists and all the closeted racists are explicit racists, blah, blah, blah. And if the administration is like that, God, hope I'm not gonna go to jail after this. Anyway, um, then why? Okay, so why were they hiding it before then? If like 2008 America, like hurraying, as I thought,
Mhm.
at like Obama's like being the president, and why now? Like, what?
Mm,
No, even why not earlier just unleash all this racism and just say, not, I'm not pro, like, it's not what I want,
mm,
right? But the
mm,
question is, why then not fight anti racism more?
mm,
Why, like, why just keep it all like under the cover and
mhm.
now only, why are they then so unsuccessful in being racist? I'm
Yeah.
sorry, this question is horrible,
Yeah,
but I kind of have
it's
it.
yeah, I get it. I get what you mean. In essence, it's culture norms. Okay, for the same reason that you don't have white slave masters that are parading around the fact that they impregnate black women on their plantation is because the cultural sentiment is that black women are essentially like uh, half humans, right? They're like monkeys. And so then you're having sex with these animals, and yeah, you might enjoy it, but it's taboo to do so, right? And so the same could be said for like the Epstein thing is like sex trafficking, sex slavery, pedophilia, all of those things are taboo culturally. So you keep it under the surface. And because you represent the wealthy, the elite, you have the means to be able to engage in your own perverse forms of deviancy without outside scrutiny or judgment because you have the means and the money to do so. It just becomes a thing where you just kind of hide those taboos under the surface. It's like a guilty pleasure. The
Oh,
same could be said
yeah.
here. Yeah.
But okay, I understand about some, let's say, explicitly anti-mainstream Christian sort of behaviors. Okay, I get it, like pedophilia and stuff. But if it's a question of power, like I can do anything, and also I'm above everybody. I'm above whoever who's poor. I'm above women. I'm above
Mhm,
black people. I'm above
mhm,
immigrants. And this is like a relaxed sort of like agreed upon.
mhm,
I feel like for the elites, maybe it's just my opinion, sort of an agreed upon notion um, so far. And the files prove that, yeah, there are further lengths, but also this is like just so accepted.
yeah,
So if this like lighter version, I mean, not explicitly torture, but just the sentiment behind it is so normal. Why not be more devoted to the sentiment? Why not like be, well, they're actually trying with Roe and Wade. Like,
Yeah,
okay, well,
but
they're actually doing it.
they're being very explicit about trying to normalize some of these things, but it's still culturally taboo. That's part of it too. It's a weird, I would go so far as to say the political position that these people work themselves into is essentially nonsensical. Like, how could you be conservative but then have Grindr and go on and be anti-homophobic out loud, but then gay behind closed doors? And it's just a thing where it's about culture norms and it's about maintaining the appearance of being consistent with the culture norms despite the anthropological reality of the situation. Um,
So,
yeah.
are you saying that the culture norm, so considering yourself above someone is not a culture norm?
No, it okay. So in that regard, when you see yourself above someone, yes, to some extent you see yourself above them, but your status or your perceived status as being high on the social hierarchy is actually dependent on the people that you perceive to be beneath you. That they essentially sustain your position of superiority. And if the collective people below you don't kind of buy into agreeing with that social hierarchy that you are above them, it's very easy for them to dismantle that. A person cannot necessarily exist in a high position of social status, economic privilege, or standing without people sustaining that, the people around them sustaining it. So, in essence, if you want to keep that status, you have to make sure that the people below you aren't a threat to it. And the best way to make sure that they're not a threat is just to kind of fall in line with the culture norms and the status quo. And so then, even though in reality you have certain deviancies about you that, deviate away from the culture norm, you kind of keep those things secret. And it's best to keep up the appearance that you adhere to these culture norms, even if it means loudly proclaiming that you do, even if you actually don't.
And this in itself is a culture norm too.
I would go so far as to say yes, the practice of uh, abusing power, sexually violating both boys and girls, but trying to train them into a position of normalcy around this. Yes, that that is a, I don't want to say a culture norm in the sense that like all Americans are doing this, but rather in the context of the slave culture of the South.
No, no, no. I
That is a
meant
yeah,
like trying to hide your actual sort of like notions or beliefs or um
like hide your
and kind of
homosexuality.
anything that's like it's a norm to hide the actual norm that's not a norm.
What
Doesn't
a weird way to
does
say that. To hide a
a
norm that
norm that's a norm, like for example doing something bad like abusing your power is a norm that's
yes.
frowned upon, so therefore you hide it, which is another norm.
Yes, and hide it, but you're still doing it. Yes.
Yeah, 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 yeah. All right, that's it. I'm out
Sure.
for a
Sure, sure.
while.
Okay, okay. Okay, so essentially then, right? Getting back to the point here, I just wanted to point that out. That was a detour. And I admit that was like a 10-minute detour. I'm so sorry for that. Um, But you have very few free black men and women in the South that are like voluntarily fighting on behalf of the Confederacy. And part of the reason why they're voluntarily fighting on behalf of the Confederacy is because you do have like house niggers and people who are the descendants of house niggers that really do buy into the idea that whiteness is superior and that maybe a way that you can gain favor in the eyes of the white people in the South is if you, a black person, lend your help to their war effort. And then the hope, anyway, is that in lending your help to the war effort, you can then gain favor in the eyes of whiteness. You don't necessarily want to be equal, right? But the idea is that might give you kind of a favor. And in response to Elena, Jen says, rules for thee, but not for me. Yeah, you could summarize it in that way, right? Um, so So even where like you have black people that originally didn't want to fight on behalf of the Confederacy, there's now an attempt to make sure that like, okay, I'm going to have to fight for the Confederacy if it means that I get to stay free. Okay. So that's happening too. Very few more slides. We're almost done here. I did take a detour and I'm very sorry about that. Okay. Now it wasn't like immediately white Confederates were like, nope, we're going to put guns in our slaves' hands. They're going to go on the battlefield. They're going to fight. Because in the same way that the Union had paranoia that black people would somehow turn against them, the Confederates also had paranoia that black people, especially the enslaved, would then turn against them and start firing on them after they gave them a gun, right? So everybody has this like racial paranoia that if we hire this black person, or if we appoint these black people into positions in which they could technically fucking turn on us or something like that, they're going to get like racial retribution. And in reality, it just becomes a thing on the Confederate side where like you could say to some extent that like once they realized that their numbers were dwindling because they really did initially commit to a whites only battle, and especially where you're confronted with like having to take other niggers as prisoners of war, and you're like negotiating military tactics for these people's lives, whose lives you really don't care about and they don't care about. It just becomes a thing where it's like, okay, well, I guess we're just going to start making the niggers fight too. So in essence, then what's interesting here is in the Civil War, you do have black enslaved people that are fighting against other black people. Isn't that interesting? And like I said, not all of the black people who are fighting on behalf of the Confederacy, I would say the vast majority of them necessarily want to fight for the Confederacy. But part of this is it's complicated. Part of this is because they grew up under the norm of white supremacy, which then means that if you are raising a child under a system of enslavement into their adulthood, it's going to be very difficult for a lot. I'm not saying everybody, but for a lot of them to really operate and think outside of that norm, right? You do have people of color that have always wanted their freedom, but in wanting their freedom, they don't also want to turn attention to shooting the white man in the face that then gets a response in which they lose their life. They care about living. So they're not really going to retaliate against the people who could really just retaliate right back against them. And then it completely defeats the purpose, right? So you do have a situation in which the Confederates kind of need their slaves for the war effort, and in doing so, are willing to then put a musket in their hands, put guns in their hands, put them in uniforms, and then make them fight on behalf of the Confederacy. In certain cases, it is the case that some of these Confederate black soldiers would then take Union black soldiers as prisoners of war and then commit them to execution, commit them to enslavement. It's just a thing where it's like the same way that we saw, it's like a repeat of the American Revolutionary War and some of the other offshoot wars that we had with Britain, where Britain then is trying to appoint black people to fight on behalf of Britain. America is trying to get black people to fight on behalf of America. Now you have black people on both sides that basically have the same interests in mind, but are basically fighting each other, while the white people are also fighting each other, and nobody's really genuinely guaranteeing black people equal treatment. Elena says, so there are people of color that are kind of pro white supremacy. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I would go so far as to say some of those names that you could go to their Instagram page right now and very clearly see that. Um, Xavier DeRusso, he has lots of posts where he's like, I love white people. I like whitey. I like the whites. And he goes really just out of his way to like defend white people when like not even white people are really asking him to. It's really bizarre. Brandon Tatum, in my opinion, this is it. These are opinions. These are not objective facts. I want to ground what I'm saying here as I'm kind of shit talking these people, but I've been shit talking them since last year. Um, I would liken these people to modern day house niggers.
And I say that not necessarily in the derogatory sense, but rather the academic and historical context in which I am then using the term, right? So I'm not using that term to intentionally try to slander these people, but rather in its appropriate historical context, yes, they are analogous to what one could call a house nigger. If you want to know more about this phenomenon, you can Google the word house Negro. The history books, Google, the public domain does a thing where they appropriate anywhere where the term nigger is used. Most of the time, they appropriate it and just change it to nigger, or excuse me, Negro. But in most colloquial circumstances, it really is just the word nigger. So, um, yes, there are black people that are pro white supremacy. Kanye West, I feel like he does it for sensationalist reasons, but he's done it for so long I kind of stopped questioning whether it was a ploy or not. Candace Owens, she's kind of backpedaled on that a little bit, but yes, Candace Owens is one of those people. Mia Love, there's lots of black people that basically bootlick white supremacy, and there's really no one is really asking them to, but the white people who are around them tend to benefit from them doing so because it means then that they can use these black people as tokens to sidestep the idea that like their political ideologies are racist or something like that. Um, yeah, Kanye West has gone. He's done a thing where he posts images of like the KKK and KKK uniforms and says he's going to wear them. That like being enslaved is a choice. I feel like Kanye West is one of those people that tries to be provocative, but doing things that are socially taboo, saying things that are socially taboo to get attention. But he's been so consistent in ways that just go beyond what you could call being like a celebrity provocateur, that it just becomes a thing where I've just I've just been willing to just go, okay, Kanye West is one of those white supremacists, and I don't fuck with him no more. I don't listen to his music. I stopped supporting that dude a long time ago. Um, yeah, no, I would liken that perspective. Elena says, I thought he was reverse fighting racism. Maybe I'm crazy or something like that. I thought that initially, but it's gone on so long that like the 4D chess explanation kind of goes out the window. Um, I feel like Kanye West has done a lot of damage to a lot of people, not just himself. But I digress. Okay. My point here is that eventually you have a repeat of the very same phenomenon that we saw in the American Revolution is black people are being used as strategic pawns. At no point is the intent on either side to give them equality, but because there appears to be fighting around it, everybody is trying to use black people strategically in this way. I would go so far as to say DEI does that too. Okay. Um, but now these are the last two or three slides here, okay? And then we'll open up for Q&A. I'm sorry for going on as long as I did, but hopefully you're interested. I seem to have people sticking around here. This is where you start to get the origins of one particular kind of Republican, a kind of Republican that has always belonged to the Republican Party is if you recall, the Republican Party got started in the industrial North, where you have all of these factories, production lines, you have business owners, the economic elite and wealthy of the North are basically providing goods in an effort to aid the Civil War. They're able to mass produce goods, and I would go so far as to say that these factories, the economic elite here, and their ability to mass produce goods, I don't want to say is single-handedly responsible for the North winning the war, but it's certainly a significant contributing factor. But now what's happening is that where a key platform of the Republican Party is promoting economic development, you have people on the Republican Party that like to say, oh, fiscal responsibility, right? The fiscal responsibility talking point actually comes from the pre-Civil War era, but also post-Civil War era too, where promoting economic development was really just about these economic powerhouses, these big businesses getting massive amounts of money from the US government to produce all kinds of goods. Okay. So, because the economic elite in the North are actually investing in the infrastructure, they're investing in economic growth and the sustain of, and expansion of the North. It means then that politically speaking, they belong to the Republican Party. They are not necessarily anti-slavery so much as they are pro give us money. Anything that makes them money is something that's good for them, right? So essentially here you have Republican policies that are helping the industrialized North to grow. And it becomes so helpful that during the Civil War, this is where they discover that they can actually engage in something called war profiteering, right? Where like you can mass produce low quality goods. It could be rations, it could be uniforms, it could be guns, it could be ammo, anything, cannon, gunpowder, anything that helps to win the war, but you're selling it to the US government at an inflated price. And so here is where the economic elite in the North, who belong to the Republican Party, because that's the political party that's prevalent in the North, they now discover that there is an opportunity here where they are generating so much money that they actually kind of just don't want the war to stop. Okay. So what's happening during the Civil War anyway, they're producing Samuel Colt, for example, who's the owner of the Colt revolver, is producing lots of revolvers that malfunction, right? That don't work as well as like something like a musket or something like that because they're trying to roll them out quickly. But in rolling them out quickly, the production cost is actually significantly cheaper than the cost that they're selling them for to the U.S. government, which then means that they're just earning a profit. And in earning a profit, the US government is unknowingly doing a thing where they are feeding a monster. And they're feeding a monster that will soon become so economically powerful that the economic consolidation that it would soon have is going to be used to influence political outcomes and government processes itself. Okay, so connect that to the modern era too, right? That you do have. Why is it that there's big money in politics? People are always talking about get big money out of politics. And Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, they were at Donald Trump's inauguration and they looked like they were high on cocaine and ketamine and da da da. And Donald Trump is the economic elite and Mike Bloomberg is da da da. Is because that's also connected to this period too. The billionaires are basically at this stage anyway. They are the descendants of the people who discovered during the Civil War era that there's actually a lot of money to be made in war. That's part of the reason why you get lots of unnecessary wars that are often started by Republican administrations, in which we create some bullshit reason for why we're going to go start a war with another country, and usually the underlying explanatory factor is less to do with like actually being in conflict with those people and is usually better explained by some form of profiteering. How can you profit from a war that you can start? And so it becomes a thing where the US then is like ultimately like it doesn't start in the Civil War era, but it's just the discovery that would soon create an avalanche in which now we get like these endless wars, right? The wars that the US gets into don't even fucking end. And like why? It's because there's capitalistic interest tied into that goes all the way back to the Civil War, in which you had the economic elite discovering for the first time that they could make money from war efforts. Right. War is a force that gives us meaning and gives the elite money. There you go. And I would say us meaning in the sense of like, yeah, perhaps all the way up to the 1940s, you had people that were led by their emotional devotion to the country, that they want to fight for freedom and fight for blah blah blah. But like now, I would even go so far as to say the former part of that statement might not necessarily be so true anymore, even though it's become a cultural "thank you for your service" kind of thing, right? But essentially, the Civil War does contribute to the growth of industrial capitalism in the North. Um, that the U.S. government is basically feeding this monster, this demon, uh, that it does not know at this period in time would become so economically powerful that it would try to take over U.S. democracy itself, right? So essentially, the Civil War is almost single-handedly responsible for fortifying the Republican Party. Yes, the Republican Party, because even the Republican Party today still is the party of big business. It kind of fortifies them as the party of big business. Okay. And so what's happening is the Civil War is the first time in which the economic elite then discover that, like, actually they can accumulate massive amounts of wealth and become economic powerhouses if there's an incentive for them to keep receiving money from the government, call it welfare. They're receiving free paychecks from the government to produce shitty goods at massively inflated prices. That then means that they become economically powerful. So, lots of connections that can be made to the modern era, and that's where we're at. For chapter 11 here, we'll soon be talking about what happens after the Civil War and how that explains the trajectory of American history. Elena had a question or a statement, and then Glinda raised her hand. I feel like the main point of today's lecture is the big message to the Black people from the Union: you fuck with your own problems yourself. I'm not sure what that means, but if you want to explain it really quickly, excuse me.
Yeah, what I meant is like that basically white people from the Union were like, you know what? Like, we don't care. Fuck with it yourselves. We're not gonna fuck with it.
Sure, sure. That's valid. Uh, Linda, yeah,
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out because I know you explained how the party were switched. So when
yeah.
you talk about the Republicans that made the basis of kind of their starting to get money from the war profiteering, would that be the Republicans from today, or is that still before the switch?
So it's before the switch, but that is a party-specific platform. So the party of big business has always been the Republican Party, but we're still these Republicans are still not white supremacist, KKK, alt-right, blah, blah, blah. Even after the switch, the economic elite stay with the Republican Party. Okay. So, and I suppose the switch here is all of the white supremacists leave the Democrat Party and join the Republican Party. All of the progressives that had historically voted Republican leave the Republican Party and go Democrat, but the economic elite always stay with the Republicans, or at least the ones that belong to the Republican Party stay with the Republicans.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Also, now that we're in the Q&A portion, apologies for going 30 minutes over, but now that we're in the Q&A portion of the stream here, if anyone in the IG chat wants to type in a question or something like that, maybe you can't join on the Zoom session, you're welcome to type your question, and I'm keeping an eye on the feed. Joshua, you have a question?
That's my bad, man. I just did that on accident.
It's all good.
I
Do you have a
literally just
question?
joined. You know me, you know I be yapping with y'all. I literally have no content matter to yap, and I joined too late, so I'm just here to listen and learn today.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, so like I said, feel free to type a question in the IG live stream if you want to. I can see it there. You're also welcome to join the Zoom session. Click the link in my bio, the link tree thing. It will take you to the Zoom session here where you can, I have the slides off now, but you can still see us anyway. We're in here. But are there any other questions? None whatsoever. I'll give it a minute or two. I hope you don't mind the fact that I took that extra time. I usually when I teach this class, I don't necessarily encourage my students to like make connections to the modern era, but I couldn't help myself this time. It seems like it's just one of those things. It's just such an easy button to press. So it's like, yeah. Just Be You 100 says, much respect to you and your students. I appreciate the dialogue and learning. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate your support. Elvado81 says, how did the Native Americans tie in during the Civil War, and what was the sentiment on supporting slave freedom? Yeah, so that's also complicated. I would say the indigenous, I call them the first Americans. Those people are much basically tied up in this war effort, much like Black people are. You have first Americans that are they live in the South and are being compelled because of the secession to fight on behalf of the Confederacy. But then you also have um, uh, first American people in the North who are not necessarily compelled to fight on behalf of the Union, but some of them do try to join voluntarily. And where they can't necessarily join voluntarily, um, some of them are still trying to aid in logistical issues and disputes. So, yeah, Native Americans are kind of involved in this. Uh, uh, they are involved, I would say minimally so. They are an extreme minority in the context of what we're talking about, but they are not entirely absent. So, thank you for your question. Um,
Now I am unmuted, man. I just wanted to pipe up just because we're in that section. If that's cool.
sure. Yeah.
But and correct me if I'm wrong, because you are literally the expert. I'm just I'm working to be an expert like the rest of us, right?
Okay.
But at any rate, that's really just like Southeast United States Native Americans too. We be forgetting about the whole rest of the daggone country.
Yep.
People like Geronimo who didn't see a white man until he was in his 30s. He was beefing with Mexicans his whole life.
Yeah.
That's why as soon as they wrap up this little showdown, it's a great question to ask about the Indians, because that's why, just like right on brand with the U.S. government, right after this little showdown, when they should be punishing their white treacherous brothers, instead they're screwing over blacks and natives. And what are they doing? They're finishing up the final revisions of the Indian Removal Acts, and they're pushing us all out west and exterminating the rest of us. And here's the icing on the cake: they're using some of these freed brothers and slaves to do it. Buffalo
Yes.
soldiers and shit.
Yes.
Oh God, the irony.
Yes. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joshua. We have another comment here. Here we go. 328 Carolyn Smith says, thank you. This was so informative and thought-provoking. You're absolutely welcome. Thank you for the lecture. Got a new subscriber. Awesome. Isn't Ye bipolar and off his meds? Yes. Kanye West, to clarify, does have bipolar disorder. I do not like to stigmatize mental health disorders or anything like that, but I do believe in accountability. And I don't think that anyone can scapegoat mental health issues entirely as a way to avoid or dodge accountability for their own behaviors or actions. And so, yes, while Kanye West's life is contextualized by bipolar disorder, he is still responsible for how he conducts and presents himself to the world. If he is able to conscientiously do it with his music and in his career and the money that he makes, he is certainly capable of doing that conscientiously in other ways too. Okay, so hold him accountable where accountability is due there. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to feel the way that I feel about Kanye West, but I don't fuck with Kanye no more. So that's just me. Elena says, just in case, I wanted to clarify that I meant that Black people weren't integrated by the people from the North, nor were these white people necessarily interested in including them. Yes, correct. And I would go so far as to say, even though Blackness is an assumed norm of American society today, Black people still fundamentally find themselves between a rock and a hard place, both on the progressive side and especially on the conservative side. There really is no comfortable place for Black people unless they're just sitting on their couch and minding their own goddamn business. And you will see people who are articulating those feelings on IG like all the time. Amy says, I appreciate the connections between history and current times. What other reason do we study history if not to better understand and address present issues? Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point. I told you that was the reason. And I think for the weeks prior, it's been a little bit difficult to connect many things to current society because you need the context for it. But I think that the Civil War is such a significant turning point in American society that spells out the rest of what happens even today, that it just becomes a thing. Like from here on out, I am going to be explicitly forcing you to make connections, and you're going to be like, holy shit, that's where that came from. Wow. Oh, oh, and like 100%, you'll start to make those connections left and right. Um, Joshua says, if you're functioning enough to be a billionaire, you're functioning enough not to be a Nazi. LOL, Kanye Cook, bro. Yeah, sure, sure. Not Ricardo says, off-topic question. What is your opinion on separating the art from the artist? Yeah, sure. To some extent, I think Kanye West, he at least early on used to produce his beats. I don't know if he still does that. Perhaps he does because I stopped following him. To some extent, yes, I can separate the art from the artist. Uh, I can recognize that Kanye West is a talented person. And me recognizing that he is a talented person is not necessarily going to stop because I don't fuck with him anymore. But I just don't fuck with him because at the end of the day, I don't support the artist anymore. The artist has put me off so significantly that even if his music is great, and I have accidentally heard some of his bangers, and they really are bangers. I still go out of my way to intentionally avoid supporting Kanye West because I don't fuck with him no more. I don't like Kanye. And on the Nazi shit, on the white supremacy, on the what was it, Harriet Tubman, the slavery is a choice, and blah blah blah, and all, and he goes on these egotistical rants. It's just for me personally, Kanye does not belong in my circle of investment. So that's where I'm at. But I don't judge anyone else for how they feel because I can recognize there are some people that are not willing to give up Kanye, even if he has his issues. Same could be said for R. Kelly or some of these other people. Sure. Um, Elena says, I wonder if nowadays conforming to whiteness or white supremacy isn't only about skin color anymore. Yes, correct. I would say it primarily is always about skin color, but there are some secondary affects, and some of those secondary affects also include uh, culture norms. That white supremacy has become a culture norm that now, for some people, it's not necessarily about the white supremacy more than it is about the culture norm that is tied to that white supremacy. So they can kind of like sidestep these ideas that they're like fundamentally racially compromised or something like that by appealing to traditional norms. But in appealing to tradition, tradition comes with the precedent of history, and the precedent of history has a timeline that is intimately connected to white supremacy, and so is therefore inseparable from it. It's just a form of mental gymnastics that people do in order to somehow justify being culturally conservative without somehow simultaneously also being a white supremacist. Fundamentally, they're you can't separate the two, but people try. Um, Elena says, what if there's a cool cultural thing, say from Japan, but people call it white? What is that? I'm not sure what you mean. Um, Care to clarify?
All right. For example, I remember once I knew some people and they were like really focused on how and where to place chopsticks in a Japanese restaurant.
Hmm.
And it was like a ritual. And I remember asking like, "Ooh, what is that? What are you doing?" And they were like, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's just the white thing."
Hmm.
And I was like, "That's weird." I mean, sometimes people would say that some things are white,
Uh-huh.
but are they even white? You know what I mean? Like, are they white?
Yeah.
Like, if there is a European tradition, even like I don't know, Oktoberfest. What is it like? Oh my God, that's just some white stuff. Isn't this label kind of also in that? I don't know how to explain that.
I'm not sure.
All
I
right,
understand. I
sorry.
understand what you're asking, but I'm not sure I have an adequate answer for that one. Sorry.
All right, I'll try to formulate my thoughts and maybe is it
Sure.
okay if I DM you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sounds like they're just dying to be white. Oh, sorry. I mean, the Joshua
Yeah,
says.
yeah, you read his comment. Yeah, yeah. Amy says, I think that identifying with privilege a privileged economic class supplants identity with a racial or ethnic class with some. Yes, and part of it is intentional. The intention is to take race off the table. Um, as I have hopefully established, some of these people have, I've been teaching you guys since my Race and Contemporary Society class. Hopefully, we've established that it is impossible to take race off the table where humans exist because humans have race and racialized experiences and bring them with them wherever they go. So it's kind of impossible to do that. But like I said, some people try. And so in so doing, they do their own form of mental gymnastics where they will try to distance themselves away from racism and notions of race as much as they possibly can justify or rationalize, but in essence, it's inseparable. So no matter how much you try to appeal to some hegemonic norm in the context of American society, it's always going to be fundamentally tied to white supremacy.
Oh, I thought it was more about taking and like appropriation, maybe even in a way. That
Well, in the
every interesting thing is white.
yeah, oh well, no. White people appropriated braids, dreadlocks, some Asian forms of culture, hip hop norms, or tropes, I would say. There's lots of things that they've appropriated that I think because of the American experiment, we know where these things come from. Um, very little can really be uniquely attributed to the phenomenon of whiteness in American society, with exception to obsessions with race, um, and consumerism. But there we go. Amy says, right, but they think they can if they feel they qualify in the privileged class. Yeah, of course, always. But they always find out at the end of the day that white supremacy only qualifies acceptance by, yeah, absolutely. You'll always get the people that try and then realize that at the end of the day, it really is still a white supremacist thing, and it was always going to be. So there's that. Elvado81 says, yep, when the ICE raids happened, a lot of people were saying America would never deport American citizens. And I was like, I guess they never heard of Operation Wetback or the Bracero accident. Yeah, absolutely. We've already been here. And sure enough, in the context of all of my lectures, I say this fairly frequently, nothing is new under the sun. Yeah, let's see. There's lots of comments and people are commenting some more. Let's see if I can get to these. Not Ricardo says, there was a part in the lecture that the people within the time recognized the wars and other overreaching acts from the government benefits the rich and those in power. Is there a point in history? I would say at the point of the Civil War, no one is necessarily cognizant of the idea that like war benefits the rich and the wealthy. Because right now, everyone really is just fixated on the race issue, the color line, and then the fact that several states seceded. So right now, the only people who are discovering that like war benefits the rich are the rich. They're just now discovering that like, holy shit, I can make like a fuck ton of money from this. And so that becomes the thing that then also influences how we see the American timeline progress too. But it has to happen for a first time at some point. And because America's fundamental system of organization is capitalist, this is technically the first time that happens. I do not know how to say this name. Data Nia Diddy 2022. I'm sorry, I butchered it, bro. Says, my time has run out. This has been so lovely. I learned and considered a different perspective. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Let's see. Capital comment. Sean Polaro of Polaro Media from Denison, Texas hates black people. I have no idea who that is. I'm so sorry. I can't respond to that. Not Ricardo says, like, I vaguely remember the huge cuts in education that limit people from developing critical thinking skills. That's actually the phenomenon of like political and intellectual stupidity that we see across America, especially with, let's say, regard to like literacy rates. That is something that actually is fundamentally tied to the precedent of desegregation in American society. That as we got desegregation in schools, you had lots of people that were protesting racial desegregation and the dismantlement of Jim Crow laws across the South, that they were like taking their children out of school. And trying to attack the education system that now allowed students of color to have access to. And in doing so, end up yet again, attacking and undermining fundamental American goals and objectives and positive outcomes, essentially undermining national security because they are so fixated on race. This is a continued phenomenon that we will subsequently observe now that Black people are officially free in American society. It literally becomes a thing where at all points in history, you have people that are so fixated on the race problem that they're just undermining their own country. They undermine national security, and so some of the consequences of that we're still observing today. This I would before I pivot. This is why, believe it or not, one of the stereotypes that we associate with people who speak Southern accents, I'm not saying this is justified, I'm just saying why this exists, is that they're like stupid. Like if they talk with a Southern accent, you automatically assume they're like a racist, white supremacist, slack-jawed yokel or something like that. Part of the stupid stereotype comes from how they fundamentally undermined American education in the South that then made them like really fucking stupid. And I'm not saying you're stupid if you have a Southern accent and blah, blah, blah. So please don't warp my words in that way, but rather that is where the stereotype comes from. Yeah. Thank you, Donice. Yeah, it sounds like an attack on education today. That's part of it. People being so fixated on skin color and race politics that they end up just stepping on their own toes and everyone else's. This is explained by a book called Dying of Whiteness, a book by Dr. Jonathan Metzl. You can find it on Amazon for probably $20 or less, a used copy for $5. He talks about this not in the historical context, but in the contemporary context, that you have the phenomenon of whiteness that is so fixated on race and race issues that they vote against their own interest and undermine the national security. Lastly, here I want to get to a few more points before we close this off. This war brings us families like the DuPonts, germination period for the war industrial context. Germination period for the war industrial complex. Yes, that's what I mean when I say this is the elite discovering for the first time something called war profiteering. I don't know what you mean about the DuPonts, though. You would have to explain that. Elena says it feels like that if not for Black people, they would go for the next race of people that look different to undermine them. Actually, that's already happening, right? That what started with a fixation on regulating Blackness and controlling access to equality for Black people, trying to regulate their legal entry into certain states, preventing them from crossing the border into the states they don't want them in. In the contemporary era, we have pivoted away from Blackness and to being Latino or Spanish speaking now. I call them the first Americans because that's who they are. They just happen to speak Spanish because the Spanish is who they were colonized by. But that's the fixation here. We're seeing a repeat of that pattern, but now we're targeting yet another non-white racial group. That we see all of the border efforts being concentrated to the US-Mexico border and absolutely none being concentrated to US-Canada at all. That should explicitly tell you that it is a racial phenomenon. They're just a super rich family in the USA that came up big off of arms sales in that war. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, so this is where we'll wrap it up for now. I'm still getting comments and I could go on forever. I'm so sorry. But hopefully this topic, wrapping up the topic of the Civil War, at least what it looked like as it unfolded, should help to expand your understanding of like how this directs the trajectory of what we see happening in contemporary US politics, is that everything that's happening has a historical explanation, has some historical connection. It doesn't just come from nowhere. And in its proper historical and cultural context, you shouldn't then be surprised that as society is like discovering all of these things that are happening in contemporary society in the United States, there is absolutely a way in which you could just tie it back to something that has already been happening in history. Amy says, FYI, Chain of Ideas just out is a good breakdown of the Great Replacement theory as applied to the present day. Also, not new ideas linked to history. Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, especially for the love that I'm getting on the IG chat. Just wanted to take the chance to tell you how much I appreciate your work. I really appreciate that, Kevin. This is where we're at. We'll wrap up on chapter 11. Next week, we'll be talking about what the post will actually, we have to end the Civil War, but in ending the Civil War, what happens after it's ended? We already know what happens. The Confederates lose. We'll wrap up those talking points, and then we'll start to turn to what the transition away from the end of the Civil War looks like. So thank you so much for joining. I appreciate your support. If you want to support me, join my Patreon. You can get access to the slides, to the readings. You can ask me any questions. I'm always responding on there. You do not have to pay for my Patreon. There is a way to access those materials for free. However, I do not turn down donations. If you want to give me $3, $5, $10, whatever, I'm not going to say no. And then I will make sure that the links and all of the reading materials for next week is uploaded. Thank you so much for supporting me, and I will see you all next week. All right.